In this lesson, we're going to be doing factoring and then solving by factoring. So the first thing we have to remember is the zero product property. And the zero product property says this: if A times B equals 0, then either A is 0 or B equals 0, or actually they both could be 0. So we use that when we do our solving of our equations by factoring. We're going to first factor and then set each of the factors equal to 0 and solve. So in this first example, we have to remember that we have to look for the greatest common factor to begin with. So we're going to divide everything by 2x. And so when we divide by 2x, we want to keep the factor. And we have x squared minus 9 is going to be equal to 0. But if we remember from what we did in our previous lesson, the x squared minus 9 is the difference of squares. So we have x plus 3, and we have x minus 3, and that equals 0. Please remember that since this is to the third power, there are going to be 3 solutions. So we set each of our factors equal to 0. So the first one, we have 2x equals 0. So divide by 2, and we know that x is equal to 0 will be our first solution. Then we'll set x plus 3 equal to 0. Subtract 3 from both sides, and we know then that x can be equal to negative 3 as our second solution. And in our third solution, we say our x minus 3 is equal to 0. We add 3 to both sides. And so we know that x equals 3 is our third solution. In our next problem, we'll again divide by the common factor, which is 3x. So if we take a 3x from each of these, we have x minus 5 as our other factor. And since we no longer have an x squared, we know that we're done factoring, so we're going to set each of these equal to 0 to solve. So 3x equals 0. We're going to divide both sides by 3. So x is equal to 0 is our first solution. Then we have x minus 5 equals 0. To solve, we'll add 5 to both sides. And so we have x is equal to 5 as our second solution. In the next example, we have x squared minus 2x minus 15 is equal to 0. So I'm going to make my x. Here's my a, my b, my c. My a times c is negative 15, and my b is negative 2. So what two numbers can I multiply together that give me negative 15, but when I add them I get negative 2? And that would be negative 5 and positive 3. And since our leading coefficient is 1, we can set up our factors right away of x minus 5 and x plus 3, and that equals 0. To solve, we're going to set each of these equal to 0. So the first one, we're going to add 5, and our first solution will be x equals 5. Then we have x plus 3 equals 0. So we're going to subtract 3 from both sides. So we have x equals negative 3. In the next problem, in order to factor, we have to have this equal to 0. So we're going to add 30 to both sides to begin with. So we have x squared plus 11x equals 0. Then we're going to make our x, and we have our a, our b, and our c. A times c in the top is 30. Our b is 11. It goes in the bottom. What two numbers multiply to be 30, but add up to be 11? So that would be 6 and 5. And since the leading coefficient is 1, we can put those right away and create our factors. So we'll set x plus 6 equal to 0, and we'll subtract 6 from both sides. So our first solution would be x equals negative 6. Then we have x plus 5 equals 0. We'll subtract 5 from both sides. And so we have x equals negative 5 as our second solution. In our last two examples, we are going to subtract 21 from both sides so that we have our quadratic equal to 0. We're going to set up our x to find our factors. A times c would be negative 42, and our b value is negative 1. So what two numbers multiply together to be negative 42 but add up to be negative 1 would be negative 7 and positive 6. But this time, since our quadratic has a leading coefficient of 2, we're going to make our box. Our first term goes in our first box, 2x squared. Our last term goes in our last box, negative 21. And we use the other two factors to make our other terms. We're going to find the greatest common factor of each row and each column. And that will be 3. So now we set up our two factors. We have 2x minus 7 and x plus 3 equal to 0. So we set them each equal to 0 and solve. First we will add 7, and then we'll divide by 2. So we have x equals 7 over 2, or 3.5, as our first solution. Then we have x plus 3 equals 0. We'll subtract 3 from both sides. So our second solution will be x equals negative 3. In the last example we need to make sure it's equal to 0. So I'm going to move everything to the left side. I'm going to subtract 2x squared. And I'm going to do this all in one step. I'm going to add 8x. And I'm going to subtract 1. So 8x squared minus 2x squared is 6x squared. 5x plus 8x is 13x. And negative 4 and negative 1 is negative 5, and that's going to equal 0. So we're going to make our x. 6 times negative 5 is negative 30. Our b value is 13. What two numbers multiply to be negative 30 but add up to be 13 would be 15 and negative 2. Because our leading coefficient is not 1, I'm going to make a box and put my first term, 6x squared, my last term, negative 5, and use my circle to make my other two factors. I am going to find the greatest common factor of each row and each column. The first would be 2x, and then we would have 5. Then I'll have 3x, and then I will have negative 1. So I have 2x plus 5, and 3x minus 1 is equal to 0. So I'm going to set each of these equal to 0 and solve. First I'll subtract 5. I have 2x is equal to negative 5, and then I will divide by 2. And so we have x equals negative 5 over 2 as our first solution. In our next, we have 3x minus 1 equals 0. We're going to add 1. So we have 3x is equal to 1. And then we'll divide by 3, and so we have x is equal to 1/3. So as you begin the student problems, what I'd like you to remember is, on the first, it's already factored. So you simply just need to set each of these equal to 0 and solve them, since the factoring work has been done for you. Also do that with the second problem in student practice number 1. Then when you get to the other student practice problems, if you take a look at number 2, please make sure you have this one equal to 0, and then the other problems equal to 0. Factor first and then solve.